Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author with over 30 published novels and a ninth grade English teacher. And on this week's episode, I'm talking to retired teacher Jennifer Bohnhoff, and we're going to be talking about her newest book, the second book in her Rebels Along the Rio Grande series, called The Worst Enemy. Jennifer, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, DelSheree. I was a teacher. I taught high school and middle school, but I am now retired and I stay home. I live in the mountains east of Albuquerque, and I can look out and see a great, huge part of New Mexico from here. It's an inspiring view, and it inspires me to do a lot of writing.
That's awesome. And you have, in part, you have a couple different settings in this book, which we'll get into because I wanted to talk to you about your research into all of that. But give our readers just a little bit of an idea of what the series and the book is about. And we'll talk about kind of where the series is going toward the end of our conversation as well.
For years, I taught New Mexico history to seventh graders, and there was not a lot of really interesting material out there. The textbook was rather boring, and that kind of inspired the Rebels Along the Rio Grande series. The first book in that series, Where Duty Calls, tells the story of the Confederates coming in from Texas and invading New Mexico, and it includes the battle at Valverde. The second book in the series, The Worst Enemy, continues that story, and it tells about the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which is the one that most people in New Mexico are familiar with, if they have any idea that we had any Civil War battle. Both books and the third book, which will be coming out this October, have got two characters. One, a boy from Texas, who joined the Confederate Army not as a soldier, but as a packer. He takes care of the mules, and he packs up the wagons and drives them. The second book, the other character happens to be an Irish orphan who joined the Union Army up in Colorado and came down and fought at Glorieta.
Well, thank you for that summary. It kind of gives us an idea of where we're at. I was able to catch up and read the first book, Where Duty Calls, and get me set up for reading The Worst Enemy. And I noticed that this is really one continuous story. And judging by the ending, which I won't say what it is, of book 2, it sounds like that story is continuing on in the third book. So I did want to ask you, as you were thinking about the concept of the story, did you initially picture it as multiple books, or did you divide up the story at certain points once you started going and realized, oh, this is going to be too long of a story for just one book?
Seventh graders don't like to read huge books, with the exception of Harry Potter. So I originally intended it to be 3 books, and that's exactly what it turned out being. The Confederate character, whose name is Jemmy Martin, is in all 3 because the story follows the Confederates up into New Mexico and then back out when the conquest of New Mexico fails and the Texans retreat. In book 1, set down at Battle of Valverde near Socorro, against Jemmy, the other side is a Hispanic boy from Socorro. But in book 2, Jemmy continues on past and leaves that boy behind.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit, kind of blending both books together on this question. Because one of the things that I noticed you included and made a point of in both books are several aspects of both class and race and who people are and how that affects their place in society. And I think that really struck me because I've been working with my ninth graders who, by the way, most of them also don't like reading long books. We've been talking about a lot of those concepts of gender roles and racial prejudice and how our culture plays a role in how we develop as human beings. And so that stood out to me because you bring up several different layers of that because you have a very diverse cast involved where you have Native Americans and Hispanic and the Texans coming in and this Irish immigrant and people from all over this area who are all being shoved together basically by these battles and the soldiers coming through different areas. So I wanted to ask you about that and why that was something that you wanted to bring up and focus on in these books.
It was a tricky business trying to explain to kids how people felt about those things 160 years ago. Because our sensibilities have changed, the things that we find acceptable have changed, and I wanted them to understand how people thought back then without necessarily condoning how they thought back then. Especially here in New Mexico, politicians would like us to believe that this is a place of this blended culture where we all get along. And we didn't always do that, and we didn't always accept each other for who we were, and we still don't entirely. So it becomes a springboard for talking about where we were, where we've come to, and what we can do to make the future even better.
I like that, especially that this is geared toward younger readers. And as I found out, kind of going through this last unit that we've been doing, there's a lot of these questions that a lot of kids haven't consciously thought about, especially if they're not the ones experiencing that prejudice or being slighted or offended because of the language somebody is using. If they haven't been on the receiving end of that, they don't recognize it in a way that starts prompting those discussions internally. And so sometimes it takes the literature or other types of media, whatever it may be, to start those conversations with these young people and showing them, okay, this is the world you live in now, but how did we get here? Because it hasn't always been like this, especially in this area, which has such a long history of strife and racism and prejudice and a lot of things that yes, we're working on and have improved, but are still a part of the daily lives for a lot of people.
Yes. When I taught middle school, one of the things kids would say, that's so racist, when they didn't really understand what it meant, when they were certainly not talking about race. When I'd say you can only use a black pen, you can't use a blue pen. Oh, that's so racist. No, it's not. So they need to understand what racism really is and what it really means. Here in New Mexico, we had very, very little in the way of African American slaves, but we had Native American slaves. And the Civil War didn't solve that problem. That problem wasn't solved for 20 years after the Civil War. And I don't think a lot of people realize that even prominent people in our society owned Navajo and Apache children that they raised within their own family and treated as servants. It's part of the history that we don't teach very often, and we need to understand that. There is a Navajo slave in book number 1 that you will see a progression in how he's treated and how people envision him come book number 3. As the Hispanic character starts interacting with Anglos and realizing that they see him differently than he sees himself. It's a big surprise, and it makes him start to think about how he views other people.
I like those kind of eye-opening moments in literature and in art in whatever form, because a lot of times if you don't get to experience that yourself, that's hard to come to those realizations, and being able to see it through someone else's eyes, through film or books or even music in some instances, can give people that window into understanding something a little bit better. So I was glad to see that you incorporated those themes and made that a prominent point of dealing with how people are treated and why people are treated differently in this series. I think those are great lessons for young readers to start learning about and thinking about and asking those questions of the world around them.
Thank you. Yes, I really agree with you. That is one of the glories of historical fiction, is you can walk a mile in somebody else's shoes.
Well, and I wanted to ask you about your research into this. Because another thing that I noticed and I appreciated with writing for young readers, especially I would think historical, I don't write historical fiction, that level of research, I think, I just don't have time for in my life right now. That feels a bit intimidating. But looking at what you include and how you describe the settings and the battles and how people are living, it's very accessible for young readers. going through it thinking kind of in my teacher brain, is this one I can add to my classroom library? Are my ninth graders going to have any hard time reading through this and understanding it? And I was really impressed that it really does a good job of painting the picture and letting people know what was going on and how people were experiencing the world at this time without overloading them with details and facts and like, oh, I'm just reading about history, how kids can get sometimes. So how did you strike that balance?
It can be a real tricky fine line between what you need to say so that they can understand what they're reading and what ends up being a history lecture.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of tough to do that. One of the reasons almost everybody in the book is actually an historical character. All the background people, all the secondary characters really existed. But my main characters don't. Jemmy and Kian and Raoul are all figments of my imagination. And one reason is I didn't want to put that many feelings into somebody who was real who may not have felt it. But another reason was I really needed these three boys to be in specific locations at specific times, and I could not find any real historical person who was every place I wanted them to be. So I made them up.
I like that.
What they do isn't made up. I use dozens of journals and diaries and first accounts of what happened. And each boy is a composite of 4 or 5 or 6 different people and what happened to them.
Oh, how interesting. So you were able to blend a lot of people's true personal experiences and mold them into the characters of these 3 boys, which I think that's a really great way to approach that and add a lot of realistic details to who they are as people experiencing these major events.
Yep. That was what I was hoping to do.
Well, good. Well, yeah, very successful at that. I enjoyed that aspect of it. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the character development, because like you said, a lot of the characters are real historical people, and you've blended them into this fictional story of the 3 boys. So I'm guessing you kind of had to approach developing those characters a little bit differently versus the real historical people and following actual events and things that are documented, where you would have had a little bit more wiggle room on the details for the 3 boys' lives.
That's true, and I think they ended up being better characters because of that. The first time I wrote the first book and gave it to my editor, Jeff, at Artemisia Press, he came back with, Jennifer, do you understand just how prejudiced these people are? And he pointed out what I needed to do to shape them into more likable people and more acceptable people for contemporary taste. And I would have had a much harder time doing that if I was dealing with real people and the absolutes of what they did. Some of the people in The Worst Enemy look pretty good at this point in history and turn into horrible villains a little later on. The biggest example of that is John Chivington. The Major seemed to be a great hero in this book, but by the end of the Civil War, he had committed the massacre at Sand Creek and was vilified, even by his own soldiers.
That's interesting, because you as the author know what these real people turn into and how their story ends. Was that at times difficult to write them as the character you needed them to be in that moment in the story?
Well, with Chivington, no, it wasn't, because there were a lot of soldiers who truly felt he was a hero at this point. Looking back at him, he's a different person. I had to kind of pick and choose who I was going to make look good. Kit Carson, who is in Book 1 and Book 3, is another person who is not received as well now as he was back then. Back then he was a hero. Now there are a whole lot of people who don't think that way about him. And that he was a much more tricky character than John Chivington to present what I believed he truly was versus what people believe he is now.
That's so interesting how that changes over time as more is discovered on one side when you have more documents found and studied and all of that, but also just the cultural and social changes over time where something was acceptable at one point. And looking back on it now in today's eyes, it's like, oh, no. No. We're not going to keep glorifying that. We need to recognize that that was a very not okay thing, or series of things with some of them to do. And that's an interesting battle, I think, to deal with, because you see that even, still today with some of the Confederate monuments and things, and people's different way of trying to deal with and reconcile the past of an area or the people in that area. And not everybody agrees on how to view that and how to live with that history in the same way.
The saying that history is written by the victors isn't necessarily as true now as it used to be, because we are looking at the other side. And I think we're getting a fuller and more honest opinion of what our history has been in places that we really shouldn't be glorifying. One of the things I want to do in The Worst Enemy, I do not want to glorify war. I do not want to glorify the Civil War. But I do want people to understand why it was fought, and that people weren't always in it for idealistic purposes. There were a lot of other reasons people were involved. Some of them very, very personal. Some of them people realized soon after that they had entered for all the wrong reasons. I think Cian Lachlan is certainly one of those. He was an orphan, and he felt like if he joined the army, they'd feed him and they'd clothe him and they'd take care of him. And he realized pretty soon on that there was a lot more to the bargain than he had really counted on. He was paying a much bigger price for being fed and clothed than he had thought he was.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was something I wanted to talk with you about as well. That, like you said, you're not wanting to glorify war, but I think oftentimes when we look back on history as a big thing, taking the timeline of events or looking at it with a broad view, we're taking away that individual personal element of what the people involved were actually experiencing. Because that is a completely different view of war than here are the battles that happened and the strategy that was used and the outcomes and, supply lines and all the technical, tactical parts of war. That is a completely different story than the people who are actually there in the moment, living it and wondering, how did I get to this point? Or why are we fighting for this? All those questions that go through your mind, I would think, as you're in the moment of that scary, stressful, crazy time, that those were not the things that they were thinking about when they joined up or were drafted or, however that came to be. That it's a very different reality of being in a war than thinking about and talking about war in the abstract.
That's an important thing for children to understand. It is not necessarily a glorious thing. And it's not necessarily just a thing that affects soldiers. It affects the entire population.
Well, and you see that with it through both books. In Jemmy's story, in book 1, his dad does not start off as the most likable person. He's pretty rough with the boys. He drinks a lot. He's not as reliable as the family might want him to be. And you don't really know why at first until you get some background on his history. And I thought it was a really interesting line in book 2 where Jimmy kind of mentions wanting to get back home and having this better understanding of his dad and thinking, maybe now that I understand him better, I can help him maybe be more patient, be more understanding in his faults. It really brought that personal aspect of what are the true costs of being involved in these wars. And that really struck me because I think, especially for young people, that's really hard to understand when you see the adults around you suffering from trauma and not understanding it. And looking at that through Jemmy's eyes in this, I thought was just a really beautiful way to communicate that to young people.
Good. I'm glad that moved you. Jemmy's dad's got post-traumatic stress disorder, but they haven't invented that term yet. They had no name for it. And soldiers who came back and they had been traumatized were just supposed to suck it up and continue on. And a lot of times then as now, those traumas and those griefs and that fear drive people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do and act in ways that they themselves probably consider reprehensible, but they just can't help themselves. Long way to go on post-traumatic stress disorder.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I was reading a book a while back, which I actually couldn't finish because it was really hard to read, called The Body Keeps the Score, and it was talking about the biological effects of trauma on people, especially young children, and how that affects them over time. And honestly, reading the book was a little traumatizing for me because I was just like, oh my gosh, this is awful. But the author of it was talking about how he was actually involved in that process of creating the diagnosis of PTSD. And I was shocked to realize, I can't remember the exact date, but I believe it was in the late 60s, if I'm remembering right. And I was just like, wow. Okay, so all those years of all these soldiers coming back, and not just soldiers, that's who they were studying at the time, but everybody who's experienced trauma, there was really no way to talk about that and deal with it. It was trying to manage some symptoms, but in a lot of ways, like you said, it was just, it was called shell shock, or basically stop talking about it and figure out how to move on. We don't know what to do with you. And
it's over now, so get over it.
Yeah. And just that breaks your heart.
In World War I. In the Civil War, they called it soldier's heart. And there is another great middle grade novel called Soldier's Heart, about a man who goes back, and I cannot remember the author off the top of my head, but it's heartbreaking to see him trying to be a normal person with all of this stuff that keeps boiling up. Jemmy is a sensitive guy. He loves his mules. It's the whole reason he got into war, was to try and protect his mule. He loves his family. He loves his father, even though his father's a difficult person. And now that he's been through this experience, he understands it. And what he desperately wants is to be able to get back and help his father. And that's what he's going to be trying to do all the way through book 3.
I'm glad to know that his journey is continuing and he's getting closer to his goals, because he's just a really wonderful character to follow. But I did want to say, with your other two characters, with Kian and Arsenio even, and Raul, that you bring a lot of emotion and heart into these boys as characters. And we see that with Kian, he's kind of searching for what he's lost throughout his life. Like he's mentioned, he's an orphan. He's kind of just doing the best he can to survive. So he's really looking for this sense of home and belonging that he hasn't had since he was a really little boy. And with the other boys, in the middle of everything that they know as New Mexicans changing. They've dealt with multiple incursions, and you mentioned that he'll start to shift his view over time as he interacts with more people and start seeing those similarities in how he's treated by Anglos and how he's treating their Native American slaves. And I wanted to ask you about your development of that and how you kind of settled in what each of the young boy characters was going to be focusing on as their goal as a character, what they're trying to reach and learn and overcome.
Well, I hate to admit this because I'm going to sound like an absolute nutcase, but I didn't develop that. They told me. That I really honestly didn't know that they each had one thing that they were trying to achieve in their life. Jemmy trying to be the gentle influence that keeps his family together. Raul trying for the respect of upper class person within the Hispanic system. Kian searching for a home and a father figure. I really didn't know they had those three specific things. They pretty much told me, and they pretty much drove that themselves.
I love when that develops organically throughout the process. That's wonderful. Well, I just looked at the time, and we are already getting short on our time, but I did want to give you time to let us know. You already said you're working on getting book 3 out into the world, which will be later this year. Tell us a little bit about the plans for that and if you're working on any future projects yet.
We've got Where Duty Calls and The Worst Enemy. Both of those come from quotes that Henry Sibley wrote into letters or said. And book 3 is also titled from a Henry Sibley quote, and that's The Famished Country. The Famished Country, Glorieta, book 2, is sometimes called the Gettysburg of New Mexico, the Gettysburg of the West, because this is high as far north as the Confederates ever made. And they were defeated, and they turned around, and they had to go back to Texas. So book 3 is the retreat, the Texan retreat. And all 3 boys are trying. They see the writing on the wall. They know the fighting is over. It's just a matter of surviving long enough to get home. And that's what all 3 are striving to do. Figure out where home is, what they really want out of life, and try and get there. That book comes out in October. It's written. It already has its cover. It's going through final edits. I'm really excited to see that come out into the world. I should say I love pictures, and I have got some really great lectures on the history of New Mexico during the Civil War with lots and lots of pictures and maps and real people behind the story. And I just love to tell those to groups, to libraries, to interested adults, and to classrooms. It's neat to see the pictures that go behind it.
And you have some illustration in the book, which I thought was wonderful. I've seen that a few times with Artemisia's books, so it was nice to have some of those illustrated visual representations of what was going on as well. But you mentioned in your bio in the book that you do classroom presentations and visits. How do people go about setting that up with you?
Their contact information's on my website, which is my name, JenniferBohnhoff.com. Spelling Bohnhoff is the hardest part of that. It's Bohnhoff. And if you contact me, I am happy to talk about what I can do for a classroom. I should say, you asked and I didn't get to it, I've got another book that's New Mexico history-based coming out next spring. And it's also coming from Artemisia Press. But it's really exciting to me because it's set during the Folsom period. So it's 11,000 years ago. And it's based on archaeology because there is no history.
Oh, how interesting. And what type of characters do you have? Is this going to be young reader literature as well, or are you working with a different age group? Good.
No, this is another book that I'm hoping 7th grade New Mexico history classes will pick up. And usually New Mexico history is taught at the 7th grade and the 9th grade level, and I think these are completely suitable for 9th graders as well. But it's the story. I went with the state archaeologist to the Folsom site where they found arrowheads embedded in ancient bison that don't exist anymore. And I walked with him and heard his story and then did a lot of research to find out how people lived during that period. And that story has also got a young boy on the edge of manhood who is ready to get out there and start proving himself as an adult.
Oh, I love that you're tackling such an interesting time period that we don't get a lot of literature from. So that sounds really exciting. And we'll have to chat about that again next year once you're ready.
Oh, boy, I would love to. And I'd love to show you all the great pictures on that one.
Well, we are just out of time at this point. I've had a lot of fun talking to you. I did want to remind our readers that the book's called The Worst Enemy, Rebels Along the Rio Grande, Book 2. And Jennifer, where can they find you and the book?
The book is available in a lot of places. It's Amazon and bookshop.org. But getting a hold of me is the website's probably the best. It's JenniferBohnhoff.com. Or going to Artemisia Press. You can find me that way too.
Well, I hope people take the time to check this out. It was great for young readers. I enjoyed it as an adult as well, and learned a lot too, which is always nice.
Thank you. That's really what I want to do, is entertain and teach at the same time.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for taking the time to talk with me today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it also.